I'm not ashamed.
What is Jesus' conversation in Matthew 24 all about? This is the question that we seek to answer today as we continue our verse-by-verse study of the book of Matthew on walking through the Bible.
The glory of his cross.
If you have a Bible with you, you can turn to Matthew chapter 24. We're going to be reading from verses 1 to 3. If you don't have a Bible, don't worry. Just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So, Matthew chapter 24, beginning at verse 1. Then Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came up to show him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said to them, Do you not see all these things? Assuredly I say to you, not one stone shall be left here upon another, that shall not be thrown down. Now as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? At the end of chapter 23, Jesus ended his public ministry. It is still Tuesday, though the day is certainly drawing on. In the next two chapters, we have Jesus teaching his disciples about the question that they ask here in verse 3 of chapter 24. Remembering that this is the context of the entirety of chapters 24 and 25 is crucial if we are to understand what Jesus is saying here. That's because of all the passages in the book of Matthew, this chapter, chapter 24, is one of the most commonly abused to teach doctrines that it doesn't, like the tribulation and the rapture. As you will see in this and the 5 episodes that will follow, we're going to show why this is true and what the chapter actually teaches. So, Jesus is leaving the temple, but as they were leaving, the disciples came to him to show him the buildings of the temple. This temple was the second temple that would have been rebuilt in the days of Ezra and Nehemiah, following the Jewish captivity in Babylon. That temple was humble compared to the one that Jesus was standing in. That's because in the 18th year of the reign of Herod the Great, and 16 years before the birth of Jesus, Herod decided to repair and build up the temple into the magnificent structure it was then. It took 9.5 years to complete, but the Jews kept adding on to it, beautifying it even further. The Jews gloried in this, not only for its appearance, but for what it represented, the house of God. It was there where all the sacrifices were performed. It is where the altar was, and it was where God had placed his name. To the Jews, the temple was everything. However, Jesus told them that all the things that they were looking at would be torn down and not one stone would be left upon another. Thinking such a thing was impossible for the Jew, for the temple was such a large structure, how could it possibly be destroyed? And if I were there, I probably would have thought the same thing. The best analogy I could give is the one that unfolded on September 11th, 2001. Some watching this podcast may not have been alive on 9/11, but you've almost certainly seen videos and pictures. I was in high school at that time, and although I had not seen the World Trade Center Twin Towers in person, I had seen them on television and in movies. They were immense, tall structures. Nobody would be able to knock them down. That is until 2 large airplanes flew into them, weakening them to the point they eventually fell. All that was left was rubble and a giant hole. That type of destruction is what Jesus is describing here concerning the Jerusalem temple. And it is exactly what happened in 70 AD when, after Vespasian and his son Titus had besieged the city of Jerusalem for 3 years, Titus destroyed the temple, and it hasn't been rebuilt since. Having now said what he said, Jesus and the disciples left Jerusalem for the Mount of Olives. Now along the way, I'm sure there was a discussion among the disciples as to what Jesus meant. When they got to the Mount of Olives, the disciples thus asked Jesus the question, Tell us when these things will be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Now to the Jew and to the disciples, this would be one question. For if the temple is being destroyed, then certainly that would signify Christ's return and the end of the age or the end of the world. But even though the disciples asked this as one question, Jesus is going to give them the actual response, which in fact is the answer to 2 questions. You see, the destruction of Jerusalem and its temple could have occurred at Christ's coming and the end of the world. However, as we'll see throughout this chapter, these are actually 2 separate events and will thus occur at different times. The temple at Jerusalem would be destroyed first, and before such time the Messiah would not return a second time. However, after the temple is destroyed, which it was in 70 AD, then the Messiah could return at any time. We are still waiting for such a return today. Thinking that this chapter refers to one event, the second coming, is to see this chapter in a similar way to the disciples, a view that is contradicted in other places in the New Testament. And that is what ultimately shows us what the truth is. The second coming of Christ is referred to in 1 Thessalonians 4, 2 Thessalonians 1, and 2 Peter 3 in plain language. Those passages teach that when Christ returns, this earth will be burned up. There will be no tribulation or rapture associated with it. It will come like a thief in the night. Remembering that Jesus is answering two questions here is essential to understanding this chapter. Please return in the next episode for the continuation of Matthew 24. With that, our time is up for today. The Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of Matthew 24, verses 4 to 14, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time.
I'm not ashamed.
Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends, so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.
Of his cross.